Hello, CPAC. Do you miss me yet?
We have the Republican Party.
I am not starting a new party. That was fake news. Actually, as you know, they just lost the White House, but it's one of those things. But who knows? Who knows? I may even decide to beat them for a third time.
Donald Trump last weekend at CPAC, making it clear it's still his GOP and teasing a possible run for the White House in 2024. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Trump trotted out his usual litany of lies, grievances, and victimhood, still pushing the big lie that the 2020 election was rigged and he actually won. He also laid out a revenge agenda, name-checking a hit list of Republicans that he wants defeated in 2022 because they voted for impeachment. That drew big cheers. It would seem that the much-touted GOP civil war was just a skirmish and Trump won. Meanwhile, the Democrats have their own divisions in Albany and in Washington. Progressives, led by Senator Sanders and Warren, among others, want Joe Biden to go big and go fast on their agenda items like the $15 minimum wage. Moderates aren't on board with some of the progressive agenda, like killing the filibuster, and aren't shy about saying so. President Biden caught in between, although with a solid Reuters Ipsos job approval rating of 57%, only 37% disapproving. So he has political capital to spend. Well, should we make of these so-called civil wars, and what will be their impact on both parties' agendas? Let's talk politics with Matt Flegenheimer, national political correspondent for the New York Times, and Times contributing writer Eleanor Randolph. Her new book, Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, just out in paperback. Matt, is the honeymoon for Joe Biden over? We have a cabinet nomination withdrawn. We have the $15 minimum wage, precarious at best. What happens to the president from here?
So honeymoon, right? I mean, it's definitely a period that I think the president and his team expected to be different than the typical first 100 days of a presidency, given the crisis, given Donald Trump's sort of specter looming after his presidency, given the Republican opposition. This was never going to be any kind of broad bipartisan legislation that we were going to see coming through the Congress in this period. But I do think his team has tried to redefine the term in some ways. They're talking about bipartisanship as a function of, voter approval for a piece of legislation around the COVID relief bill, as opposed to whether a series of Republican senators might be supportive. So I do think there is an attempt to reframe that conversation in terms of the public as opposed to the representation in Congress. And we'll see where that goes. Obviously, at this point, as you mentioned, the Tandon nomination, there have been some hiccups, but I don't think there is any kind of wide-scale panic about the state of his presidency at this stage.
Eleanor, how do you see the president walking this tightrope at this point? He's obviously got a tough road to balance there, but so far, as Matt says, he seems to be doing a fairly good job. And part of the problem, I guess, or maybe it's not a problem for him, is where else do liberals have to go?
It's true. I mean, you have to go back to the election, to the primary. Remember, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were basically, they lost to Biden, who was in the middle path to get the Democratic nomination. And it's worth remembering that the Biden people say they're trying to unite the country, not the Congress. And he makes that point sort of over and over again. I mean, he's doing some things that the liberals really like he's suddenly taken on the mantle of the unions and gone after Amazon in Alabama to support the union movement there. So he gets credit and probably blame for being on both sides. I think the $15 an hour minimum wage will come back at some point because it's very popular. I mean, Florida voted for it, for example. And I think the infrastructure bill that they're going to start working on right now is going to be fascinating because, I mean, who's going to get what? Where does that bridge go? To nowhere? Or, what road? Or so that's going to be a very important thing for Biden to be doing next.
And Matt, I don't understand how the Republicans can run in 2022, much less in 2024, on a platform of just saying no when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to the minimum wage, when it comes to other issues like that. How do they just say, we didn't want to do this, we voted against this, when they don't seem to be putting forth proposals of their own? When it comes to voting rights, we had a story in the Times just the other day saying that not only in the Supreme Court, but in state legislators, they are trying to act to take away votes or reduce the voting rights of people. How do you justify something like that?
Well, again, it certainly depends on the district. It depends on the state. I think you're seeing a lot of Republicans defining their politics right now around sort of broader cultural issues more than any particular policy play. The sort of cancel culture debate, as they put it, issues that are not necessarily things that can be remedied by legislation. And the sort of Trump moment or extended moment over years in the Republican Party has so permeated the way the Republicans define themselves, both as lawmakers and as voters, that something like an infrastructure bill might not rank in a GOP primary in a pretty red district.
Have any Republicans come out and said, I am against Donald Trump as a candidate in 2024? I am an independent, I disagree with him, period. Or is it still his Republican Party?
I mean, there are very few and far between. You have a handful of representatives, Mitt Romney in the Senate, a couple of others who voted against impeachment, or voted for impeachment rather, obviously for removal last month. Or in January rather. I think broadly speaking, it certainly appears to be his party. You saw at the CPAC gathering in Florida these past several days, just one speaker after another, essentially pledging fealty to Trumpism and to Trump himself. And obviously the former president was down there for his own speech to sort of raucous applause. So I do think, given a handful of exceptions, there is some constituency in a very narrow set of circumstances, in a very narrow set of districts, moderate districts, where you might see a little bit more hesitance to be fully deferential to former President Trump. But broadly speaking, it's his party.
Walking before the weekend, and the drama regarding Governor Andrew Cuomo is still unfolding, of course. But Eleanor, you and I have covered the governor. We know a little bit about his personality. How do you explain what's going on, why this is happening all of a sudden, and why the governor, frankly, doesn't seem to be handling it very well? Among the other things that I find astounding in cases like this is the offhand apology, if I offended anyone, instead of simply coming out and saying, I'm sorry.
I was thinking the other day that he looked really good when he was, mano a mano with Trump. There were these two sort of tough guys, and Cuomo was, New York tough and all that sort of stuff. And that is his game plan. And that is, he wears that mantle as often as he can, riding a motorcycle and all that sort of stuff. In many ways, what we're seeing is that Cuomo's power is diminishing. I mean, his power over the legislature has diminished, and he was given all this extra power to deal with a pandemic. Now the legislature is going to take most of that away from him. So as you see his power diminishing, I think it makes him an easier target for things that have probably been problems for longer than we know. My dealings with him, he would call on deadline and the decibel level would go up, but that was the way he operated, and that is the way he operated. I think the most interesting thing has been watching Mayor de Blasio trying to wipe the biggest smile off his face ever in his own history as mayor. I mean, okay, there's joy when your enemy suffers, but he suddenly is sort of hinting that he might run for governor. It's quite a scene out here.
Yes, he can contain himself. You're absolutely right. Matt, you've seen this from New York when you covered politics here, and now on the national level. A couple of things I don't quite get. Punishing the governor by taking his powers away regarding the pandemic seems almost silly to me. And also, I look back at the case of Eliot Spitzer, who resigned, and that resignation seemed to be more the result that he had no support in the legislature. He did nothing to build up a pool of support, where Andrew Cuomo may not be the most likable character in Albany, but he seems to have a little bit more political support, or at least develop a little bit more fear among legislators who might not want to take him on, even though he is in a third term and some of that wears a little thin. How do you compare the two, and where is the line where he as a politician, a public figure, becomes kind of vulnerable in that way?
I think the analogy is that, if you make a lot of enemies on the way up, at your own moments of political peril, you don't have a lot of friends necessarily. There are people, as I mentioned, Mayor de Blasio, first in line, who are going to sort of delight in your demise. And to your first point, I do think there is something symbolically meaningful about the emergency powers being pared back. And we saw this conversation happening already prior to some of these allegations around the nursing home handling during COVID. And I do think there is, again, at least symbolically, something to be said for the legislature, even in its own sort of limited way, asserting its power, announcing its presence as a branch of the government. And again, given the sort of broad deference we've seen Governor Cuomo enjoy over the last 10 years in office, any sort of signal that there is a limit and that there is a desire to limit his power does seem like a change. And regardless of where this goes, that dynamic seems likely to persist.
Eleanor, it's obviously he said, she said in these things, as it always is. But if there's a consensus that what these women, and perhaps more will come forward as well, if what they say appears to be true, are those grounds for resignation? Is that a line that is too big a line to cross? Where do we draw the line these days for people in public office, or anyone for that matter?
That is the hardest question ever. But I think, it's very hard to figure out what has really happened in these situations. There's one woman who said he touched her back and then asked if he could kiss her. Well, he asked. And then there are two other situations that are really a little more troubling, but in one case, he denies that it even happened. So I have to admit, after Al Franken was bumped from the US Senate, in a New York minute, that I think that going through the process of trying to investigate this and figure out what really happened will give us all some understanding of how important it is, and whether or not, the real sort of dynamic has always been the powerful male versus the woman who is trying to get ahead. That's sort of how it has worked over the years. Now, there's no doubt he's a powerful male. Let's just see what the Attorney General comes up with. I will really look forward to that. And I think, as I said, after Al Franken, we need the investigation to go forward.
So we need, in effect, due process rather
Right.
than something more quick. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times and Matt Flegenheimer of the New York Times for joining us. And coming up next, what's on Andrew Yang's mayoral agenda? We'll ask him. This is Bill de Blasio's last year as mayor, and there's no shortage of people who want the job. One of them is former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang. With his unorthodox campaign style, he remained a player in the presidential race for longer than many of the more well-known and experienced politicians. He created lots of national buzz, but the question is, will that translate into votes in Brooklyn? The Times writes, quote, he now turns to the New York City mayoral race with significant name recognition, a vivid social media presence, and a demonstrated ability to raise money. But his high profile is leading some of his rivals to take potshots at him over everything from spending time out of town during the early days of the pandemic to a video he posted about bodegas. The Times writes, quote, while their digs highlighted some of his weaknesses, they also illustrated how the candidates view Mr. Yang as a threat. We're pleased to welcome Andrew Yang to the program, and thank you for joining us. Mr. Yang, you ran for president and lost. Now you're running for what John Lindsay used to call the second toughest job in America. If you lost for the first, what makes you at least as qualified for the second?
You know, I think it might have been the New York Times that suggested I run for mayor. But as you described, my presidential campaign succeeded in activating millions of Americans around a vision of our economy that worked for us, that worked for our families. And right now, New York City, my city, is in the midst of a crisis, and I think I can accelerate our recovery. That's why I'm running. I think I can speed up the process through which we get through this time. And to the other side, when we actually can restore some of the 700,000 jobs we're missing, the 60 million missing tourists, and even maybe bring back some of the 300,000 New Yorkers who've relocated out of our city.
How do we do that? You're talking, one of the key points of your campaign is a universal basic income. That's sort of a Washington prerogative. And in Washington, we can't even get them to endorse a $15 minimum wage. So how, as mayor, would you be able to do this?
Well, here in New York City, we have a very different operating landscape. And so what I'm proposing is actually just cash relief for folks who are in extreme poverty to help get them into better or keep them in more stable situations. Because the fact is, Sam, if they end up in our sheltering system or other institutions, we spend thousands of dollars a month. So we're actually going to save money if we can keep people in their homes. But the restoration of our economy revolves right now upon getting people vaccinated. And then after you're vaccinated, you have to be able to quickly verify that you've been vaccinated as you enter your office building or eventually a restaurant, bar, Broadway theater. So we need to have that kind of app on your phone where you can just wave it as you go into your building. And it just says green, you've been vaccinated. New York City is fundamentally a place-based economy. Right now, Midtown Manhattan commercial real estate is 82% unoccupied. The same is true in Times Square. So we need to give organizations the confidence to bring their employees back, because when those commuters are back in the office building, it's not just that building, it's the food trucks, the retail, the security guards, the cleaning staff, and everyone else who relied upon that office being occupied.
Should we convert some of that office space to affordable housing or some other usage?
I think we should be looking at converting first some of the unoccupied hotels, because again, we're missing 60 million tourists. I just walked by a hotel yesterday that was completely dark and closed. And we have an affordability housing crisis right now in the city. So we should be meeting the need with the opportunity and look at repurposing some of these hotels and some of the unused commercial office spaces as affordable and supportive housing.
The Independent Budget Office came out with a report this week that says the economy seems to be doing a little bit better than everyone thought. And if that is so, and if that keeps up, should we still be heeding the calls to tax the rich? And let me ask you a question that no one seems to ask. How do we define the rich in New York these days?
Well, Sam, I'm focused on the issues that are within the city's control. And for the city, the main lever that we control is not income taxes, because that's going to come through Albany, but it's property taxes. And when I've looked at the property tax regime in New York City, there are vast inequities that are actually holding us back. There are property owners in parts of Brooklyn who tend to own family homes that are frankly getting overtaxed, where they're paying 7 times the effective property tax rate as the owners of condos in parts of Manhattan. And that's bad on so many levels, but it's bad in part because it's taking money out of the hands of people that would spend it in our economy. So this is a massive opportunity to unlock some of the value in our incredible real estate market and put money back into people's hands. I like to focus on the things that the city can control, because right now we're again in the midst of a crisis, and we have to look at every lever available.
Wouldn't that mean we had to raise property taxes on other properties though?
Well, there are ways to do it that are revenue neutral that would be very, very positive for the city. But I would agree that we should be looking at opportunities to generate additional revenue in a way that's not going to hold back our growth and recovery. And right now, some property owners are objectively paying much, much less than their fair share. And a lot of those property owners tend to be, frankly, at the very, very high end, where I believe if you could levy additional property taxes on some of those properties, it would be a positive.
You said that we need to the whole issue of desegregating select schools. There are a lot of things we need to do in this direction. What are the things we need to do?
Well, I'm a public school parent myself, Sam. And I think that most parents have the same impulse that my wife Evelyn and I had, which is to find the public school near us and have that public school offer the kind of experience you're excited about. And it's really only when that option is not available to parents that they then end up sending their kids to other neighborhoods, looking for other alternatives. So job number one has to be to try and provide a public school environment that parents are excited about sending their children to. And one of the things that we have failed at, in my opinion, is that we have outsourced our ability to help our kids to some of these tests, where if you're a teacher and you identify that a child has a spark and could benefit from an enrichment program, you know our children best. Like, we should be able to follow your guidance and have that child in an enrichment program and not have that child sit for a citywide test that gets administered X times a year. We need to let students and school administrators do their jobs more effectively. And if we succeed at that, then we can fulfill parents' original wish, which is just to have our children go to a school that we're excited about, that's also representative of community.
But we should continue to keep those gifted and talented programs, so-called?
Well, I'm on the record saying that I thought getting rid of those programs was not the right move because no one knew what came next. And again, I'm a public school parent. Parents tend to make decisions months or years in advance, and we dislike uncertainty. So if you're going to make a move around eliminating gifted and talented both tests and programs, you would need to have a very, very clear next step for children who are in that program or children that thought they were going to be tested this year.
One of the other points in your platform is the city should be running the subway system. How can we afford to do that when that really seems to be a regional problem and ought to be financed regionally?
My argument would be, how can you afford not to? Where you have the main arteries through which New Yorkers travel to school and work every day. Pre-COVID, 5.5 million people rode the subway every day. And when there have been issues, what has happened to us? Turned around and said, who's responsible for this? The city's not responsible. You have an MTA board that's dominated by people from outside New York City. If you're going to manage this city's recovery, you need control over subways, buses, and the ways people get to work and school every day. Now, that's one issue. The other issue is the fact that our mass transit system loses money regularly and that we're facing various budgetary pressures. But to me, the fact that you may need to fight for aid for New York City Transit and the MTA from the state and the feds while it's under city control should not mitigate the fact that we need control of our own destiny.
Let me ask you about the governor and the problems he's having right now. Do you think he should resign? Do you think he's crossed a line involving the women who have accused him? And where is that line for public officials these days?
I have joined the calls for an aggressive independent investigation of the activities that the governor is accused of. And that to me is the right next step. We need a degree of certainty, but we also need a degree of due process where if it comes to light that some of these things are true, then I think we can have very serious conversations about what the next step is. But to me right now, the appropriate step is an investigation. So New Yorkers have the facts.
Let me ask you two questions. Is an investigation by the Attorney General independent? And if the allegations we're hearing now are true, should the governor resign?
I think what this attorney general is going to do should qualify as independent, given the standards of past investigations. And if what has been alleged is true, I think that the governor is going to have a very difficult time governing. And so he would, I think, be in a position where he'd want to consider what's best for the people of New York State.
One quick last question. Why do we need someone who is outside the political system rather than a New Yorker who knows the city best?
Well, our bureaucracies have not been through for us at a high level, and New Yorkers can sense it. One frustration I've had as a parent is that our schools have been closed for months and months, and that's been very, very difficult for a lot of families, even though the data has shown that we could have reopened schools for younger children and at-risk children, and on balance, we could have done that more aggressively, more quickly. I have run a private company, I've run a nonprofit, I've helped activate millions of Americans around a vision of an economy that works better for us and our families. But right now, most New Yorkers, in my view, want someone who's going to get things done, who's pragmatic, who's solutions oriented and driven by information and data on what is working for people. And that's what I'm offering to the people of New York City. And I think it's really resonating. I get tremendous enthusiasm everywhere I go.
Thanks for joining us, Andrew Yang, mayoral candidate. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.